Left at the altar, no one could imagine what would happen next. That broken young woman would meet the billionaire who'd change everything forever. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the ending will make you believe that sometimes the universe knows exactly what it's doing. The final chord faded into the air like an unfulfilled promise, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any ovation. Eliza Harlow remained motionless before the grand piano, her fingers suspended above the ivory keys that seconds before had betrayed her talent. From her position on the stage of Carnegie Hall, she could feel how the eyes of 800 people bore into her back with the precision of pins in a dissected butterfly. Sometimes the greatest chasm lies not between who we are and who we want to be, but between who we once were and who we can no longer recover. The midnight blue silk dress, chosen specifically for this night, that was meant to consecrate her as the new promise of classical music in America, now seemed to weigh a ton on her delicate shoulders. The error had been catastrophic, unforgivable, in the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 precisely in its most emblematic passage. Her fingers, those same fingers that since the age of 5 had danced across the piano with mathematical precision and an almost supernatural sensitivity, had frozen. The score she knew by heart had vanished from her mind like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. The murmur began slowly, creeping between the red velvet seats like a serpent, growing into a buzz of barely disguised disapproval. Critics in the front row were already furiously scribbling notes, preparing obituaries for a career that had only just begun to blossom. As she descended from the stage, her legs trembled so much that she feared she would collapse before reaching the safety of the green room. The conductor, the legendary Maestro Wainwright, looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and pity that felt infinitely worse than any reprimand. "These things happen, Eliza," he said with a tired voice, but his eyes betrayed his words. "Rest and we'll talk tomorrow." The green room, with its walls lined with photographs of celebrated artists, seemed to mock her as she closed the door. The mirror returned the image of a stranger, a 28-year-old woman with makeup smudged by tears she didn't even remember shedding, her bun coming undone in rebellious locks that framed a face where panic had carved lines that hadn't existed before. In that moment, as the echo of her failure reverberated in every cell of her body, Eliza Harlow made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would never perform in public again. The small house on the outskirts of Lenox, Massachusetts, seemed to have aged decades during her 3 years of absence. Eliza contemplated the whitewashed facade, now peeling from neglect, as the taxi drove away down the dirt road, leaving behind a cloud of dust dancing in the golden Berkshire afternoon light. The garden, once meticulously tended by her grandmother, was now a wild chaos of lavender, rosemary, and thyme that had claimed every available inch. It wasn't so different from what had happened to her own life, the cultivated yielding to the wild, the structured crumbling before forces she didn't know how to control. "Eliza, my goodness, you're back!" The raspy voice of Mrs. Winthrop, the neighbor she had known all her life, startled her. The woman, now more stooped and with completely white hair, looked at her from the fence separating both properties as if seeing a ghost. "Hello, Mrs. Winthrop," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've decided to spend some time here. 3 years without setting foot in town, and now you appear just like that, without warning. Your grandmother would be so pleased. God rest her soul." The mention of her grandmother was like a dagger between her ribs. Guilt, always latent, resurged with renewed force. She hadn't been present when the only person who had truly supported her exhaled her last breath. "Need help with your bags? I could call my grandson." "No, thank you. I travel light these days." A merciful lie. The truth was that the only thing she brought with her was the invisible weight of shattered expectations, abandoned dreams, melodies she could no longer interpret without panic constricting her throat. The key turned with difficulty in the rusty lock. The interior of the house welcomed her with an embrace of stale air and memories suspended in time. There stood the old Yamaha upright piano, where she had played her first notes, now covered by a white sheet as if it were the corpse of an extinct animal. Awards and recognitions from her prodigious youth lined the mantelpiece, silent witnesses to a promise that was never fully realized. That night, after opening windows and dusting off years of accumulated neglect, Eliza sat on the back porch with a glass of inexpensive wine, contemplating the mountains silhouetted against a star-speckled sky. The silence of the Berkshires was overwhelming after years in New York, but also comforting. Here no one would recognize her as the pianist who collapsed, the great disappointment, the one who couldn't handle the pressure. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. The name of Harriet, her former agent, illuminated the screen. It was the 15th call in 2 days. With a deliberate movement, she turned off the device. The outside world would have to wait. First, she needed to reconcile with silence before she could contemplate the possibility of filling it again with music. Days began to blend into one another with the monotony of an abandoned metronome. Eliza established a simple routine revolving around domestic tasks, cleaning away years of neglect, pulling wild weeds from the garden, repairing leaks. Physical work that exhausted the body but left the mind restless, especially during the nights, when silence amplified memories. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she finally yielded to the impulse she had been ignoring since her arrival. With trembling hands, she removed the sheet covering the old, upright piano. A cloud of dust danced in the air, catching the moonlight filtering through the window. The yellowed keys seemed to stare at her expectantly, like old friends waiting for an explanation for her long absence. Her fingers caressed the keys without pressing them, like someone caressing the cheek of a lover they fear to awaken. When she finally gathered the courage to press a C major, the out-of-tune sound that emerged was like a slap. She closed the lid with an abrupt motion that resonated throughout the empty house. The next morning, while buying provisions at the small-town market, the curious glances of locals followed her like persistent shadows. Lennox was too small for the arrival of a former resident to go unnoticed, especially one who had appeared in national papers as the great promise of classical music before her spectacular fall. "Eliza Harlow? Is that really you?" The deep, warm voice caught her off guard as she examined tomatoes. Turning, she found a vaguely familiar face that the years had transformed. A man in his early 30s, with hazel eyes that seemed to contain an ancient sadness and a smile suggesting he knew secrets about her. "I'm Nathaniel Thorne from high school. We shared Ms. Holloway's literature class." Memory finally connected the pieces. Nate, the quiet boy who was always writing in a worn notebook, who won that poetry contest and then disappeared from town to study abroad. Nate, of course. It's been a long time. 16 years to be exact, he replied, and there was something in his tone suggesting he had counted each of those years. "I heard you're staying at your grandmother's house." "News travels fast in this town," she commented with a tense smile. "Some things never change, others change too much." There was an intensity in his gaze that was disconcerting, as if he were seeing layers of her that even she no longer recognized. "What brings you back, Nate?" "The last news I had was that you were conducting an orchestra somewhere in Europe." A shadow crossed his face, so brief she might have imagined it. "Let's say I'm taking a break. Needed some familiar air." Something in his tone suggested there was more, much more behind those carefully chosen words. A secret, perhaps a failure of his own, was hidden in the folds of that seemingly simple explanation. "Well, welcome to the club of those who flee," said Eliza, surprising herself with the brutal honesty of her words. Nate's laughter was genuine, a warm sound that seemed out of place in the cold, austere market. "May I invite you for coffee? We could catch up on our respective escapes." She should have said no. She had come to Lennox precisely to avoid conversations like this, to hide from anyone who might recognize her, or, worse, who knew music well enough to ask why she had quit. But there was something about Nate, in the way he looked at her without expectations or judgments, that disarmed her defenses. "All right, but I warn you I'm not the best company these days." "What a coincidence," he replied with a half-smile. "Neither am I." The Tanglewood Cafe was a narrow, cozy place located on a cobblestone alley in the shadow of the town's historic church. The century-old stone walls were decorated with sepia photographs of old Lennox, creating the sensation of being suspended between different eras. "This place has always fascinated me," commented Nate as he stirred his espresso. "It's as if time doesn't run at the same rhythm as in the rest of the world." Eliza observed how his fingers held the small spoon with the unconscious elegance of someone accustomed to conducting orchestras. Expressive hands, with small scars and calluses on the fingertips that spoke of a life dedicated to music. I suppose that's exactly what I came looking for, she admitted. A place where time moves differently, where I can... She stopped, unsure how to complete the sentence. Heal, hide, reinvent yourself, offered Nate, with an intuition that felt almost invasive. Perhaps all three, she responded after a pause. How did you know that you were running away? He completed with a sad smile. I recognize the signs. The way your eyes avoid any conversation about music, how your fingers constantly tap, as if looking for a phantom keyboard. The tension in your shoulders when someone looks at you for too long. The scrutiny was too accurate, too intimate. And what about you? She counterattacked, defensive. Why has the great conductor Nathaniel Thorne returned to this forgotten town? Last time I checked, you were guest conducting the Berlin Philharmonic. Nate's expression hardened momentarily, before softening into something resembling resignation. London, actually. And it wasn't exactly a triumphant visit. The silence that followed was laden with unspoken confessions. Through the window, they could see tourists photographing the church, oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few feet away. I had a collapse, he finally said, the words coming out as if each cost a monumental effort. In the middle of Beethoven's Ninth, I simply went blank, as if someone had disconnected my brain from my arms. 80 musicians looking at me, waiting for directions that weren't coming. The confession shook Eliza to her core. It was too similar to her own experience, too coincidental to be chance. Me too, she whispered, the words emerging after 3 years of self-imposed silence. At Carnegie Hall, Rachmaninoff. Their gazes met then, and something indefinable passed between them, a mutual recognition, an understanding that went beyond words. There's a curse on us, the prodigies of Lenox, said Nate with a bitter smile. Perhaps we should have stayed in this town, playing at local weddings and giving lessons to grumpy children. Do you think there's a life after failure? She asked, surprising herself with the vulnerability she showed before this man who was simultaneously a stranger and someone who seemed to understand her better than anyone. Nate kept silent for a moment, as if mentally composing his response. I don't know, but I'm trying to find out, he finally said. I've rented the old Blackwood house on the outskirts. I'm working on something. Curiosity stirred within Eliza like a flame she thought long extinguished. A new project? You could say that, he responded evasively. It's complicated to explain. Perhaps you could come see it someday. The invitation floated between them, fragile as a note in the air. Accepting it would mean opening a door Eliza had kept firmly shut. The door to the world of music, to the possibility of renewed failure, to feelings she had buried under layers of self-protection. Maybe, she finally replied, aware that those 2 words contained more hope than she had allowed herself to feel in years. The old Blackwood house stood on a gentle hill, surrounded by a grove of centennial pines that protected it from the implacable New England sun. It was a 2-story structure, with a red tile roof and thick stone walls that kept the interior cool even on the hottest days. Eliza lingered a moment at the wrought iron gate, hesitating, her hand suspended inches from the bell, as if touching it might trigger some invisible catastrophe. 3 weeks had passed since that coffee with Nate. 3 weeks during which she had tried to convince herself not to come, that it was better to keep her distance, that any connection to the musical world would only reopen poorly healed wounds. And yet, here she was, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't rationally explain. Finally she pressed the bell. The sound reverberated in the distance, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch eternally. When she was about to turn around, convinced she had made a mistake, the main door opened and Nate appeared in the doorway. He wore worn cotton trousers and a wrinkled white shirt, with sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His dark hair was tousled, as if he had spent hours running his fingers through it in a gesture of concentration or frustration. On his left cheek was an ink stain that gave him a curiously youthful, almost vulnerable air. You came, he said, and there was a note of surprise in his voice, as if he had lost hope of seeing her. I was passing by, lied Eliza, aware of how absurd it sounded. Thought I'd say hello. Nate's smile suggested he saw through her transparent excuse, but he had the delicacy not to comment. Come in then, forgive the mess, I don't receive many visitors these days. The interior of the house was a study in contradictions. The antique dark wood furniture, contrasted with cutting-edge technology. Books and scores piled on every available surface, as if the bookshelves had reached maximum capacity long ago. In the center of the main room, dominating the space like a ship anchored in a disorderly port, was a gleaming black Steinway grand piano. Eliza stopped abruptly upon seeing it, her body instinctively tensing like an animal detecting a threat. "Don't worry," said Nate softly, noticing her reaction. "I won't ask you to play." The tension slightly left her shoulders, but her eyes remained fixed on the instrument with a mixture of longing and terror that Nate seemed to perfectly understand. "Tea? Coffee? Something stronger?" he offered, guiding her toward the kitchen, deliberately moving her away from the piano. "Tea would be fine, thank you." While Nate prepared the drinks, Eliza observed the kitchen wall, covered by what appeared to be fragments of scores, notes scribbled on napkins, strange diagrams connecting musical concepts with arrows and circles. It looked like the mural of a mad scientist, or perhaps a composer obsessed with an elusive idea. "What are you working on exactly?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her habitual reserve. Nate handed her a steaming cup before answering, his eyes fixed on the diagrams on the wall. "It's hard to explain. I'm trying to create something new, something that goes beyond traditional composition. A piece that can heal, for lack of a better word." "Heal whom?" The question floated between them, laden with unexpressed meanings. "All of us. The broken musicians. Those who have lost their music." There was an intensity in his voice that was almost feverish, a fervor that bordered on obsessive. "Sounds ambitious," she commented, unsure how to respond to such an emotionally charged statement. "Or delusional," he admitted with a twisted smile. "Depends on whom you ask." "My former therapist would probably vote for the latter." The casual mention of therapy opened a crack in Nate's carefully constructed facade, offering a glimpse of a pain deeper than he had let show. "Would you like to show me what you have so far?" asked Eliza, surprising herself with the proposal. Nate's eyes lit up with a hope so pure, so naked, that it was almost painful to contemplate. "Do you really want to see? It's experimental. You'll probably find it strange." "I think I surpassed my quota of normalcy a long time ago," she replied with the first genuine smile she had offered in weeks. He led her to a room at the back of the house that had been converted into an improvised studio. The windows were partially covered by heavy curtains, creating a diffuse light that gave the space a dreamlike air. State-of-the-art recording equipment shared space with ancient instruments, a cello propped against the wall, a flute on a stand, a small synthesizer connected to a softly humming computer. Nate sat before the computer and, after hesitating for a moment, pressed a key. The music that emerged from the speakers was like nothing Eliza had ever heard. It began with spaced piano notes, almost reluctant, that gradually merged with subtle electronic sounds and samples of natural sounds. Raindrops, the distant murmur of wind through trees, the constant beating of a heart. The melody, if it could be called that, didn't follow traditional patterns, but seemed to evolve organically, like a living being that breathes and grows. Eliza closed her eyes, letting the music envelop her. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of failure, the paralyzing fear of making a mistake, the shame of unfulfilled promise. In its place, she experienced something close to peace, as if the music were untangling knots within her that had been strangling her for years. When the piece ended, she opened her eyes to find Nate watching her intensely, his face a mixture of vulnerability and hope. "Well?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The words seemed inadequate to describe what she had just experienced. "I don't know how to explain it. It's as if you found a new language to express something that has always been there, but that we've never been able to name." The relief that flooded his face was so palpable that Eliza felt a lump in her throat. "That's exactly what I'm looking for," he said, leaning forward with renewed intensity. "A musical language that can express and heal trauma, specifically the trauma of musicians." "How did you arrive at this idea?" Nate leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that Eliza was beginning to recognize as a sign that he was organizing complex thoughts. "After my episode in London, I couldn't approach a score without having panic attacks. The doctors called it burnout syndrome, post-traumatic stress, professional exhaustion. labels that didn't really explain what I felt. As if music itself, the one thing that had always defined me, had become my enemy. Eliza nodded, painfully recognizing the description. One day, almost by accident, I was playing with some sounds on the synthesizer, without a score, without expectations, just experimenting. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid. I began to research neuroscience, music therapy, sound patterns that affect different areas of the brain. He pointed to the diagrams on the walls. I believe we can reconfigure our relationship with music, create something that heals instead of demands. His words resonated within Eliza with unexpected force, awakening something she thought dead: hope. And what do you need to complete it? The question visibly surprised Nate. I need collaborators, musicians who have experienced the same kind of trauma. I need your perspective, Eliza, your experience, your sensitivity. The proposal hung between them like a rope over an abyss. Accepting would mean directly confronting what she had been avoiding for 3 years: her identity as a musician, her relationship with failure, the possibility of failing again. I can't play, she finally said, the words coming out broken. I can't sit in front of a piano and... I'm not asking you to play, he interrupted gently. At least not now, not like that. I'm asking you to listen, to feel, to help me understand how music can heal instead of hurt. Eliza looked around the studio, at the elaborate diagrams, the silent instruments, the computer humming with unexplored possibilities. For 3 years, she had built a life designed to keep music at a distance, to protect herself from the pain of failure. And now this man appeared, offering her a bridge back, not to the world that had destroyed her, but to a new one they might build together. I'll think about it, she said finally, but something in the way her fingers unconsciously drummed against her thigh, following the rhythm of the piece she had just heard, suggested she had already made a decision. The collaboration began tentatively, like an unsure melody finding its way. 3 days a week, Eliza walked to Nate's house, each time with fewer reservations, each time more eager to immerse herself in the project that was gradually redefining her relationship with music. Her initial role was simply to listen. Nate composed segments, experimenting with combinations of acoustic, electronic, and ambient sounds, and Eliza offered her impressions, describing the emotions each passage evoked, the tensions it created or dissolved in her body. It's fascinating, commented Nate one afternoon as they had coffee on the terrace after a particularly intense session. When you work with a traditional orchestra, musicians give you technical feedback. This passage is too fast. Here we need more rhythmic clarity. But you talk about how the music makes you feel physically, the images it evokes, the knots it unties. Eliza contemplated the mountains in the distance, their contours softened by the evening mist. Perhaps because I no longer see myself as a musician. I'm experiencing music as someone would, who doesn't have the burden of having to interpret it. And yet your observations are precisely what I need, he replied. We're trying to create something that goes beyond perfect technical execution, something that connects with that wounded part that professional musicians tend to ignore in our pursuit of excellence. The conversation drifted to their respective experiences as prodigies, the implicit and explicit pressures, the crushing expectations, the sacrifices they had made for a career that eventually betrayed them. Sometimes I wonder who I would be if I had never played a piano, confessed Eliza. If I had had a normal childhood, with toys instead of scales, birthday parties instead of competitions, real friends instead of rivals. Do you regret it? The question floated between them, laden with implications. I don't know, she answered honestly. Music gave me moments of such pure joy, such deep connection with something greater than myself. I don't know if I would have found that elsewhere, but the price was high, too high. Nate nodded, understanding perfectly. My therapist said we developed a toxic relationship with music. We turned it into our complete identity, our only source of validation. And when we failed, when music betrayed us, it was like losing our entire reason for existing. And how are we supposed to relate to it? Asked Eliza, genuinely curious. Like with a lover, he responded after a reflective pause. With passion, yes, but also with healthy boundaries. With admiration, but without idolatry. With surrender, but maintaining parts of ourselves independent of that relationship. The analogy resonated deeply with Eliza. illuminating aspects of her relationship with music that she had never considered. "And you believe your project can help us rebuild that relationship?" "It's what I hope," he answered, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that contrasted with the confidence he normally showed. "Not just for us, but for anyone who has experienced that traumatic rupture with their vocation." As the weeks passed, the collaboration evolved. Eliza began to suggest more concrete changes, a sustained note here, an altered rhythm there, the incorporation of strategic silences that allowed the mind to process the evoked emotions. Without realizing it, she was composing again, though in a completely different way than she had done before. It was during a particularly productive afternoon when the turning point occurred. Nate was struggling with a passage that felt incomplete, trying different approaches without success. "Something's missing," he muttered in frustration, running his hands through his hair repeatedly. "It needs a different texture here, something that contrasts with the electronic but isn't completely acoustic." Eliza, who had been listening with closed eyes, slowly stood and walked toward the piano. The silence in the room became dense, charged with anticipation and fear. Her hands visibly trembled as she approached the keys. "Can you play that section again?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Nate obeyed without a word, restarting the sequence. Eliza closed her eyes, letting the music surround her, and then, almost without thinking, her fingers found the keys. It wasn't a structured melody that she played, but atmospheric fragments, loose notes that floated over the electronic bass like snowflakes in a gentle wind. There was no score, no expectation of technical perfection, just pure emotional expression. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find Nate looking at her with a mixture of amazement and contained emotion. "That," he said simply. "That's exactly what was missing." Eliza looked at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else, marveling not only at having played, but at having done so without the paralyzing panic that had tormented her for years. "I don't know how. It just happened." "Because you weren't trying to be perfect," responded Nate softly. "You were communicating, not executing, feeling, not thinking." That night, as she walked back to her house under a starry sky, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A lightness, as if she had let fall an invisible weight she had been carrying. It wasn't a complete cure. It wasn't a triumphant return to the stage, but it was a first step toward reconciliation with the part of herself she had tried to bury. The path would be long, full of setbacks and moments of doubt, but for the first time in 3 years, she could visualize a future in which music once again became a source of joy instead of trauma. And that future, surprisingly, included Nathaniel Thorne, a man who was as broken as she was, but who somehow seemed to have the fragments that fit perfectly with hers. The news arrived like lightning on a clear day, unexpected and disruptive. Eliza was in Nate's kitchen, preparing coffee while he adjusted some details in the studio, when her phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from Harriet, her former agent, who had continued to send occasional messages despite Eliza's persistent silence. "Need to talk to you urgently. They've announced a commemorative gala for Carnegie Hall's 130th anniversary. They're contacting all the outstanding soloists of recent decades. They want you for Rachmaninoff, the same concerto, Eliza. The opportunity to rewrite history." The phone slipped from her trembling hands, hitting the floor with a noise that drew Nate from the studio. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed by her pale expression. Eliza showed him the message, unable to articulate words. Nate read it in silence, his face transforming from concern to a complex mixture of emotions. "What are you going to do?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Do?" Eliza let out a dry, almost hysterical laugh. "There's nothing to do. It's absurd, impossible." "Is it?" The question floated between them, challenging and provocative. "It's been 3 years, Nate. 3 years without playing seriously. My technique must be rusty, my reflexes dulled. And besides, have you forgotten what happened the last time? Do you think I can simply go back there and face—" She stopped, unable to complete the sentence, to name the fear that still consumed her. "I think you could if you wanted to," he responded with a calm that contrasted with her agitation. "Not right now, not without preparation, but in a few months, with work." "Why are you saying this?" she interrupted, confusion giving way to unexpected anger. "We're supposedly creating something different." Something that heals, not that throws us back into the jaws of the monster that destroyed us. Nate's expression softened, and he took a step toward her with hands extended in a conciliatory gesture. Because sometimes, Eliza, healing means confronting exactly what broke us, not running from it, but transforming it, giving it new meaning. "You talk like my therapist," she muttered, crossing her arms defensively. "Maybe you should listen to yours as much as I listen to mine," he responded with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. A tense silence followed, laden with unspoken words and unconfessed fears. Finally, Nate spoke again, his voice softer. "I'm not saying you should do it. I'm just saying you could if it were something you wanted, and that you wouldn't be alone this time." The implicit promise in those last words shook her. Throughout her career she had been alone, on stage, in the interminable hours of practice, in the moment of failure. The idea of having someone by her side, someone who truly understood the abyss she faced, was as novel as it was disconcerting. "I need time to think," she finally said. "This is too much." "Of course," he replied, stepping back to give her space. "Take all the time you need." That night, alone in her grandmother's house, Eliza dusted off boxes she had kept sealed since her arrival. They contained memories of her career, concert programs, framed reviews, photographs of her bowing before standing audiences, and buried at the bottom, the scores of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, with her own annotations in the margins, silent witnesses to countless hours of study. Her fingers caressed the yellowed pages, tracing the notes like someone retracing old scars. The music seemed to rise from the pages, resonating in her mind with a clarity that surprised her. 3 years, and each note, each dynamic nuance, each phrasing was still etched in her memory, as if she had practiced it just yesterday. The piano in the living room remained covered, silent. Eliza approached it slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal that might attack or flee. With a deliberate movement, she removed the sheet that covered it. The old Yamaha emerged, less imposing than Nate's Steinway, but laden with more personal history. Here she had played her first notes. Here her grandmother had listened to her practice. Here she had forged her identity as a musician long before it became a prison. She didn't sit down. She didn't open the lid. She wasn't ready to take that step. But for the first time since the incident, she allowed the possibility to exist in her mind. The idea of playing again, not just experimentally as she had done with Nate, but with purpose, with direction. The idea of confronting the demon that had destroyed her, and perhaps finding redemption. The next morning she found Nate in his studio, working on a new section of their joint project. He seemed not to have slept, with pronounced dark circles and hair more disheveled than ever. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. "I'm not going to accept Carnegie Hall's offer. I'm not ready, and I don't know if I'll ever be, but—" She paused, gathering courage for the second part of her decision. "But I want to play again on my terms, at my pace, without pressures or expectations. Just reconnecting with that part of me that I miss, even though it terrifies me." The smile that illuminated Nate's exhausted face was like a sunrise after an endless night. "I think that's the bravest decision you could make," he said with a voice hoarse with emotion. "Would you help me?" she asked, naked vulnerability in her voice. "Not as a master, not as a conductor, but as a companion in this. Someone who understands." Nate nodded, unable to speak for a moment, visibly moved. "It would be an honor," he finally managed to say. "We could incorporate it into our project, use our therapeutic approach as a bridge toward traditional interpretation." The proposal made sense. It was a gradual path back, one that respected her fears, without allowing them to dictate the terms of her relationship with music. And besides, it would give them time to explore another harmony that was developing between them, a connection that went beyond creative collaboration, deeper than mutual understanding of shared trauma. "There's something else you should know," said Nate, his tone changing to something more serious. "I received a call yesterday. The Boston Symphony Orchestra is interested in the project. They've heard rumors about our work. They're intrigued by the therapeutic approach. They want me to present a formal proposal for a research residency." The news was surprising, an external validation that neither had actively sought. "Nate, that's incredible. It's exactly what you deserve." What we deserve, he corrected. It's our project, Eliza. Your sensitivity, your perspective have been fundamental. I want you to come with me to Boston if you decide it's something you want. The proposal hung between them, laden with possibilities and complications. Boston meant returning to the professional world of music, though from a different angle. It meant leaving the refuge she had built in Lenox, facing again the pressures and expectations of the international circle, and it meant deepening her relationship with Nate, exploring what they could be to each other outside the protected context of their small town. "I'll need to think about it," she finally said. "Everything is changing so quickly." "I know," he responded with an understanding smile. "And that's okay. There's no rush, no pressure, just possibilities." Possibilities. The word resonated within Eliza like a perfectly tuned note. After 3 years living in the past, trapped in the frozen moment of her failure, she could finally glimpse a future. An uncertain future, full of challenges, but also of potential to heal, grow, and perhaps love again, both music and this man who had unexpectedly appeared in her life like a surprising variation in a familiar melody. The teacup shattered against the floor, fragmenting into dozens of pieces that scattered across the kitchen tiles like discordant notes. Eliza remained motionless, looking at the pieces with a vacant expression while the amber liquid formed a small puddle at her feet. 6 weeks had passed since the invitation to Boston, 6 weeks of careful and gradual practice, of reconnecting with the piano under Nate's patient guidance. 6 weeks in which she had experienced moments of almost forgotten euphoria upon rediscovering music on her own terms, free from the external pressures that had previously crushed her. And then, this morning, panic had returned without warning, triggered by a simple technical error in a passage that should have been easy. A tiny error, insignificant to any other pianist, but one that for her had amplified until it became irrefutable proof of her fundamental failure as an artist. The sound of hurried footsteps preceded Nate's appearance in the kitchen, alarmed by the crash. "Are you okay? What happened?" Eliza looked at him with glazed eyes, as if she didn't completely recognize him. "I can't do this," she said, in a monotone voice. "I thought I could, but I can't." Nate crouched to collect the fragments of porcelain, giving her a moment to compose herself. "What happened exactly?" he asked calmly, without pressuring her. "An error, in the second movement. My fingers simply froze. Just like that night," her words came out broken, as if each required physical effort. "It's as if my body remembers the trauma, Nate. As if my hands have their own memory of failure and refuse to move forward." "It's normal," he replied, standing after collecting the larger fragments. "The body stores trauma just as much as the mind. It's part of the recovery process to face these setbacks." "What if it's not a setback?" she counterattacked, frustration giving way to anger. "What if it's simply the truth? That I wasn't made for this? That I should never have tried? That this whole project is just an elaborate form of denial?" Nate left the fragments in the sink and approached her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to convey support. "I don't believe that for a second," he said with conviction. "I've seen how you transform when you play, Eliza, how music flows through you in a way that few artists achieve. A technical block doesn't define your value as a musician." "That's easy for you to say," she muttered. "Your career didn't end in a spectacular public collapse." As soon as the words left her lips, she regretted them. Nate's face momentarily hardened, and a tense silence settled between them. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "That was unfair. I know you've suffered too." "Don't apologize for telling the truth," he responded with a sad smile. "My collapse happened in a general rehearsal, not in the official concert. Only the orchestra musicians witnessed it, not 800 people and critics from across the country. You had a public exposure that I didn't experience." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that she had learned to recognize as a sign that he was carefully considering his words. "But that doesn't mean I don't understand the terror, Eliza. The moment when your brain simply shuts down, when your body rebels against you, when everything you believed you knew with absolute certainty vanishes like smoke." The raw sincerity in his voice penetrated the fog of Eliza's self-pity. She observed this man who had appeared in her life like a disruptive note in a predictable composition, who had offered understanding without pressure, support without expectations. "How did you overcome it?" she asked, genuinely curious. How did you go from not being able to conduct to creating something new, to being ready to present it in Boston? Nate considered the question, leaning against the counter. I don't think I've overcome it completely, he admitted. There are days when the fear returns, when I doubt every decision, when I wonder if this whole project is just an elaborate way to avoid facing the truth of my limitations. The honesty of his confession was comforting in its vulnerability. But I learned something important in therapy, he continued. That healing doesn't mean absence of pain or fear. It means developing a different relationship with that pain, one where it doesn't completely control you. He approached her, and after a brief hesitation took her hands in his. It was the first time they shared such direct, intentional physical contact. His hands were warm, slightly rough, with the calluses characteristic of someone who had spent decades holding a baton. These hands, he said softly, tracing the lines of her palms with his thumbs. They've created beauty for years. They've spoken a language that most people can only listen to, never articulate. One error, or even 100 errors, doesn't change that fundamental truth. Eliza looked at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else, trying to see them through Nate's eyes, as instruments of creation, not of failure. I'm so afraid, she whispered, the words escaping before she could contain them. Not just of failing again, but of what would happen if I didn't fail, of who I would be, of what would be expected of me. I know, he responded, his voice equally soft. Success can be as terrifying as failure. It forces us to redefine who we are, to face possibilities we had discarded. Their hands remained entwined, creating a closed circuit of understanding and connection. We don't have to decide today about Boston, continued Nate. Not even about whether you'll continue playing Rachmaninoff. We only need to decide about this moment, about the next small step. And what would that step be? She asked, finding comfort in practical concreteness. You could try something completely different, not Rachmaninoff, not traditional classical music. Perhaps improvise on some of the pieces we've been developing for the project. Without a score, without expectations of technical perfection, just pure expression. The proposal made sense. It was a lateral path, a detour from the route that had provoked her panic, but one that still led her forward in her relationship with music. I could try, she finally conceded, but not today. I need space. Nate nodded, releasing her hands with a last gentle pressure. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. The simple promise of presence, of accompaniment without pressure, was like an anchor amid the emotional storm Eliza was experiencing. She realized with sudden clarity that something fundamental had changed in these months. She was no longer alone before the abyss. It was no longer simply her against her demons. She had an ally, someone who understood the rough terrain she was traversing because he himself had traveled similar paths. That afternoon, as she walked through the cobblestone streets of Lenox, reflecting on the emotional roller coaster of recent weeks, Eliza found herself before the town church. She had avoided entering since her return, fearful of the memories it might awaken. Here she had given her first public recital at 11, playing Bach on the historic organ under her grandmother's proud gaze. However, something impelled her to climb the worn stone steps and push the heavy wooden door. The interior welcomed her with the familiar mixture of incense, candle wax, and the characteristic silence of sacred spaces. It was almost empty at this hour, with just a few tourists scattered about admiring the stained glass and an elderly man praying on a side pew. She sat on a bench at the back, letting the quietness of the place envelope her. The organ remained silent, but in her mind she could hear the echoes of that first recital, the childish nervousness, the absolute concentration, the pure joy of receiving applause. At what moment had music ceased to be a source of joy, to become a prison of expectations? When had the love of sound been eclipsed by the fear of error? And would it be possible, truly possible, to find a path back to that primordial joy? The questions had no easy answers, but for the first time in years Eliza felt she was asking the right questions, and perhaps, with the help of Nate and the project they were building together, she could begin to find some answers. As she left the church, the late afternoon sun bathed the square in a golden light that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. Like music, she thought, like love. Both had that alchemical power to transform the mundane into the transcendent. And perhaps after all there was still hope for her to experience both in their fullness. The Lenox Public Library was a modest but welcoming building, with dark wood shelves and large windows that filtered natural light, softening it into the perfect kind of illumination for losing oneself among ancient pages. Eliza had discovered this refuge weeks ago, and now spent hours there, especially on days like today, when she needed distance from her piano, from Nate, from all the expectations that had begun to accumulate again around her. She had settled in a remote corner, surrounded by books on music therapy, neuroscience, and trauma psychology. Her notebook lay open before her, the pages filled with notes, diagrams, and reflections on her own process. After the panic episode, she had decided to approach her recovery with the same academic rigor she had once applied to her piano technique. "Miss Harlow, may I speak with you for a moment?" The soft but firm voice startled her. She looked up to find Mrs. Caldwell, the head librarian, a woman in her 60s with an impeccable grey bun and red-rimmed glasses that amplified the vivacity of her dark eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell," Eliza responded, instinctively closing her notebook as if protecting a secret. The woman sat across from her with a contained grace that spoke of years moving among packed shelves without disturbing the sacred silence of the place. "I've noticed your reading during these past weeks," she began, discreetly pointing to the pile of books, "and I wondered if you'd found what you're looking for." Eliza blinked, surprised by the direct question. "I'm not sure I know exactly what I'm looking for," she admitted. The librarian smiled warmly. "Sometimes the best discoveries happen when we don't know what we're seeking, but I was referring to something more specific. I see you're researching the connection between trauma and art. I have something that might interest you." She rose with a fluid movement and gestured for Eliza to follow. Eliza accompanied her through narrow corridors to a door marked "Local Collection." The interior was a small room with shelves containing old documents, photographs, and books related to the history of Lenox. "Few know this," said Mrs. Caldwell, as she searched among the materials, "but there was a time when this library housed a small music therapy program. It was in the 80s, long before such concepts were mainstream. It was part of a pilot project for veterans with post-traumatic stress from Vietnam." She extracted a thin archive box and placed it on the central table. "Here it is. Documentation of the project, therapist notes, even some recordings on cassettes." Eliza looked at the box with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Why are you showing me this?" The woman studied her for a moment, her penetrating eyes behind the red glasses. "Because I recognize the look of someone trying to rebuild themselves through art. I've seen it before. And because I know your story, Miss Harlow. In a town like this, news travels." Eliza felt a pang of discomfort at being recognized, at knowing that her failure was public knowledge even here, in what she had considered an anonymous refuge. "I'm not looking for pity," she said, more brusquely than she intended. "And I'm offering none," responded the librarian with equal firmness. "What I'm offering is historical context, perspective, evidence that you're not the first artist to struggle with trauma, and certainly not the last, and perhaps some ideas that might complement what you and Mr. Thorne are trying to create." The mention of Nate surprised her. "How do you know about our project?" The woman smiled enigmatically. "As I said, news travels, especially when two renowned musicians settle in our small town and begin creating something that could change lives." She let her words settle before continuing. "You can borrow these materials. They're part of this place's history, and perhaps also part of your future." With that cryptic declaration, Mrs. Caldwell left her alone with the box and her thoughts. That night, Eliza spread the contents of the box across her kitchen table. Yellowed reports, handwritten notes, black and white photographs of groups of people, some visibly tense, others smiling timidly while holding simple musical instruments, and 5 cassette tapes simply labeled with dates. She had no way to play them, but the written documents proved fascinating. The therapists had developed an innovative approach for their time, using specific rhythmic patterns to help patients process traumatic memories, incorporating silence as a therapeutic tool as powerful as sound, and adapting improvisation techniques to allow emotional expression without the restrictions of formal music. Among the notes, she found a diary written by one of the participants, a former military man who had been an amateur pianist before his experiences during Vietnam left him unable to play. His words resonated deeply with Eliza. The piano was my enemy for years. Each key seemed a trap, each chord a threat. The silence between notes was an abyss where my darkest thoughts fell. But here, in this strange group, I'm learning to listen again. Not just to the music, but to the space between notes. To inhabit that space without fear, to breathe within the silence. There was something tremendously moving about finding these words written decades ago by someone who had navigated waters similar to hers. It was an invisible thread connecting her to a community of wounded artists across time, reminding her that her struggle, though unique in its details, formed part of a broader human tapestry. The next morning she brought the materials to Nate's house. She found him in the garden, pruning roses with the same concentration he applied to conducting an orchestra, each cut precise and considered. "Nate," she called from the gate, "I need to show you something." He looked up, surprised by her unexpected arrival after days of distance. He set down the pruning shears and walked toward her, removing his gardening gloves. "Eliza," he greeted with a cautious smile. "I'm glad to see you." There was a new tension between them, a space created by the panic episode and her subsequent withdrawal. But there was also something more, an underlying current of connection that seemed to strengthen even in distance. "I've been researching," she said, showing him the box. "And I believe I've found something that could help us with the project." During the following hours, they reviewed the documents together, Eliza translating her enthusiasm into detailed explanations about how these pioneering approaches could integrate with the modern techniques Nate had been exploring. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and soon both were bent over the dining room table, scribbling ideas, drawing diagrams, building a bridge between past and present. "This is exactly what we needed," said Nate, running a hand through his hair with excitement. "A historical precedent, documented results, an approach that integrates the best of traditional music therapy with our vision." "And look at this," added Eliza, pointing to a passage in the notes. They used the concept of safe sonic space, creating acoustic environments where participants could experiment without fear of judgment. "We could develop that using modern technology, create virtual spaces where traumatized musicians could gradually reconnect with their instruments." She stopped, noticing Nate's intense gaze. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "It's just that—" He paused, seeking the right words. "It's wonderful to see you like this. Passionate, lit up, full of ideas, as if you've found something that anchors you back to yourself." The comment, so simple and direct, unexpectedly moved her. Because he was right. In these hours of immersion in therapeutic possibilities, she had been completely present, free from the crushing weight of her past, focused on a future where her trauma didn't define her relationship with music, but informed a new way of understanding and sharing it. "I think you're right," she admitted softly. "I've been so focused on what I lost, on what I can't do, that I didn't see the path opening before me. A path where my experience isn't just a scar but a tool to help others." Nate extended his hand across the table, not demanding contact but offering it. "That's always been the goal of our project, hasn't it? To transform trauma into something constructive, into a source of connection instead of isolation." Eliza looked at his extended hand, that simple bridge between two people who had experienced similar forms of rupture and were trying, together, to build something new from the fragments. "I don't know if I'm ready for Boston," she said, finally placing her hand on his. "But I think I'm ready to keep moving forward, wherever this path leads us." The smile that illuminated Nate's face was like the sun emerging after a prolonged storm, revealing a landscape transformed by rain but fundamentally intact, even renewed. "It's all we can do," he responded, intertwining his fingers with hers. "One step at a time together." In that moment, sitting among ancient documents and new possibilities, with their hands entwined over scores and diagrams, Eliza felt something she had forgotten. Hope. Not the naive hope of her youth, which believed in perfect trajectories and guaranteed successes, but something more mature and resilient. A hope tempered by failure, informed by pain, but not diminished by them. A hope that, like the music they were creating together, found beauty in both harmony and dissonance, in both notes and the silences between them. The news came through a phone call on a Sunday morning. Eliza was in the kitchen preparing coffee when her phone vibrated on the marble countertop. Nate's name flashed on the screen, provoking an involuntary smile. They had established a routine of working together on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, leaving weekends for personal reflection and rest. "Good morning," she answered, balancing the phone between shoulder and cheek while pouring coffee. "It's early for you on a Sunday." The silence on the other end of the line was her first indication that something was wrong. When Nate finally spoke, his voice sounded tense, distant, as if he were making a monumental effort to maintain composure. "Eliza, something's happened. The Boston Symphony Orchestra has cancelled their interest in our project." The coffee cup halted midway to her lips, suspended in the air like an interrupted note. "What? Why?" Another silence, this one heavier. "Someone sent them a video of my episode in London, the exact moment when I froze in front of the orchestra. Apparently, it's been circulating in certain musical circles as a kind of morbid curiosity." Eliza felt the floor sway beneath her feet. She sat down slowly, setting the cup on the table. "Who would do something like that?" "It doesn't matter who," Nate responded, his voice now more controlled but laden with a bitterness she had never heard before. "What matters is, they've decided they can't associate with someone who represents professional instability." Those were their exact words. The injustice of the situation hit Eliza like a slap. After months of meticulous work, exhaustive research, gradual recovery, everything was crumbling because of a moment of human vulnerability captured and shared without consent. That's absurd. Our entire project is precisely about normalizing and healing these moments of vulnerability, about changing the toxic culture of perfection at all costs. "The irony doesn't escape me," Nate replied with a dry laugh, devoid of humor. "But it seems the classical music world isn't as ready for that conversation as we hoped." Eliza felt anger growing within her, an emotion surprisingly welcome after years of paralyzing fear. "I'm coming over," she said, already rising. "We shouldn't have this conversation by phone." 20 minutes later, she was at Nate's door, breathless from the hurried walk. When he opened, the contrast with the man she had seen 2 days before was alarming. He seemed to have aged years in 48 hours, with pronounced dark circles, stubble, and a defeated posture that broke something inside her. Without thinking, she stepped forward and embraced him. It was the first time they had shared a complete embrace, and Nate's initial surprise gave way to total surrender, as if all the muscles he had kept tense for days finally yielded to human contact. They remained thus in the doorway, for a time neither measured, communicating through touch what words couldn't adequately express. When they finally separated, Eliza kept her hands on his arms, a physical anchor amid the emotional storm. "Let's sit down," she said softly. "And you're going to tell me exactly what they said, and then we'll decide together what to do next." In the studio, Nate showed her the formal email he had received from the administrative director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. The language was courteous but unequivocal. They regretted to inform him that after an internal reconsideration, they had decided to pursue other directions for their music research program. "They don't directly mention the video, but the timing is too coincidental," he explained, passing a hand over his tired face. "My contact in the orchestra, a violinist who was a colleague at the conservatory, called to warn me. He said the video arrived anonymously to several members of the board of directors. Some argued that my project was valuable precisely because it addressed these issues, but in the end, fear of risk prevailed." Eliza felt a wave of nausea, imagining the renewed humiliation, the violation of privacy that Nate must be experiencing. "That's cowardly of them," she said firmly. "And cruel of whoever shared the video." Nate nodded slowly, looking through the window toward the garden where newly pruned roses were beginning to bud again. "The worst part is that it makes sense from their perspective. Why risk it with a conductor who has a documented history of nervous collapse? There are dozens of impeccable young talents waiting for their chance." The acceptance in his voice was the most heartbreaking thing, as if part of him believed he deserved this rejection. "No," Eliza responded with a vehemence that surprised even herself. "We're not accepting that narrative. If they reject this project, it's their loss, not ours. What we're creating is too important to let it die because of fear of public perception or the narrow-mindedness of an institution." Nate looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration, as if seeing a new facet of her. Where does this sudden ferocity come from? Eliza considered the question, reflecting on the transformation she had experienced in these months of joint work. I think it's always been there, she finally responded. But I was so focused on my own fears, my own failure, that I forgot how to defend myself, how to fight for what I believe in. She approached the piano and ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them, a gesture that now felt natural where before it would have provoked anxiety. You know, when I failed at Carnegie Hall, I experienced it as a definitive sentence, as if the universe had decreed that I didn't deserve to be on a stage. And for 3 years, I accepted that verdict without questioning it. She turned to look at him with a new clarity in her eyes. But that's happened to us now. This rejection from Boston, I don't feel it as a sentence. I feel it as an injustice we can fight. And I think that's the difference between being trapped in trauma and beginning to heal from it. Nate rose slowly, as if Eliza's words had injected an energy that began to dissolve the weight of defeat. Are you suggesting we continue with the project despite Boston's rejection? I'm suggesting we continue precisely because they rejected us, she responded, determination solidifying within her. Because every door that closes for musicians who have shown vulnerability is exactly the reason why our work matters. She approached him, the intensity of her conviction shortening the physical distance between them. When you invited me to collaborate, you told me you wanted to create something that would heal all of us, the broken musicians. And there are many more like us, Nate. Musicians who collapsed under pressure, who developed debilitating stage anxiety, who abandoned brilliant careers because perfectionism destroyed them. We don't need institutional validation to reach them. The spark of hope that began to shine in Nate's eyes was like the first ray of sun after an endless night. What exactly are you proposing? Eliza hadn't planned a speech, but the ideas flowed with a clarity that surprised herself. I propose we continue developing the project and share it directly with those who need it most. We can create a website, organize small workshops here in Lenox to start, document our methods and results. Build from the bottom up instead of waiting for validation from above. Nate considered her words, the initial defeat gradually transforming into something resembling determination. It would be a harder path, he finally said, without institutional backing, without the symphony's prestige, without the resources they would have put at our disposal. Harder, yes, Eliza conceded, but also more authentic, more aligned with what we're trying to create. A space where vulnerability isn't punished, but honored as part of the artistic process. A silence followed as Nate processed her words, the studio full of unexpressed possibilities, divergent paths, decisions that would define not only the future of the project, but also of their relationship, which had grown intertwined with their creative work. You know, he finally said, with a faint smile appearing on his tired face, when I met you, I thought I would be the one to help you heal. I never imagined you would end up being the one to rescue me in my darkest moment. The naked honesty in his voice, the complete vulnerability he showed before her, awakened an emotion that Eliza had been containing for weeks, perhaps months. Without words, she stepped forward, eliminating the distance between them, and placed a hand gently on his cheek. It's not about rescuing or being rescued, she said softly. It's about walking together, holding each other when the path becomes too steep. Nate's eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that seemed to illuminate every corner of her being. Slowly, as if giving time for doubt or retreat, he inclined his face toward hers. When their lips met, it was like a long-rehearsed musical piece finally finding its perfect interpretation, familiar and surprising at once, intimate and universal. The kiss was brief but deep, a moment of connection that transcended words. When they separated, Eliza saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt, as if they had simultaneously crossed a threshold they had been contemplating for months. So, he said, his voice slightly trembling, do you really think we can do this? Continue without Boston? Without institutional backing? Eliza smiled, a smile containing both the fragility and strength they had discovered together. I believe we can try, she responded. And I believe the attempt itself, regardless of the outcome, is already a form of healing. In that moment, in a studio filled with silent instruments and half-completed scores, Both understood they had found something more valuable than external recognition. They had found a traveling companion for the rough path of recovery, someone who understood both the heights and depths of the artistic life, someone who could sustain both their music and their silence. And that understanding, that deep connection born of shared wounds and rebuilt hopes, was a more solid foundation than any institutional validation could have provided. The morning sun filtered through the linen curtains, drawing changing patterns on the scores scattered across the studio floor. Eliza, sitting cross-legged on the worn rug, contemplated the work of recent weeks with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Since Boston's rejection and their joint decision to continue regardless, she and Nate had completely restructured their approach. They were no longer developing an academic presentation for an elitist institution, but a practical, accessible program designed for real musicians who struggled with trauma and creative blocks. They had spent weeks condensing complex research into concrete exercises, transforming neurological theories into simple practices, incorporating the historical findings from the Lennox archives with modern technology. The result was a fascinating mosaic, a hybrid methodology that combined elements of traditional music therapy, mindfulness techniques, structured improvisation exercises, and guided composition, all wrapped in an approach that honored traumatic experience as part of the artistic journey rather than an obstacle to overcome. What if we call it the silence between notes? Nate's voice from the doorway startled her. She hadn't heard him return from his morning walk, absorbed as she was in contemplation of their joint work. She turned to find him leaning against the frame, holding 2 cups of coffee, his hair still damp from the shower, and a renewed energy that had been absent during the dark days following Boston's rejection. "I like it," she responded, gratefully accepting the cup he offered. "It captures the essence of what we're doing. It's not just about the notes, the technique, the perfect execution. It's about learning to inhabit the spaces between them, to find meaning in the pauses, in the breathing, in the imperfection." Nate sat across from her, their knees almost touching, creating an intimate circle around the unfolded papers. "Do you know what day it is?" Eliza tilted her head, confused by the apparently irrelevant question. "Tuesday, isn't it?" "It's June 3rd, he responded, with a significant smile. "Exactly 3 months since you first appeared at my door." The realization surprised her. Only 3 months? It seemed impossible that in such a short time she had experienced such a profound transformation, going from self-imposed isolation to this intense collaboration, from creative paralysis to the production of something that could help others. "It feels like a lifetime," she murmured. "In a way, it is," he responded, his gaze soft but intense. "I feel I've lived more fully in these 3 months than in the previous 3 years." The honesty in his declaration resonated within Eliza, like a perfectly tuned note. She too felt she had emerged from a long period of emotional hibernation, that parts of herself she had believed dead were awakening, stretching toward the light like plants that find the sun after an endless winter. "Do you remember what you asked me that first day?" she said, looking at the piano that had been the silent witness to her evolution. "You asked me if I believed there was a life after failure." Nate nodded, remembering perfectly that moment in the cafe when 2 strangers connected by similar wounds shared vulnerabilities for the first time. "I think I have an answer now," she continued. "There isn't a life after failure. There's a life with it, through it, transformed by it. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't completely erase itself. It integrates into who we are, how we perceive the world, how we create." She took a sip of coffee, organizing her thoughts. "It's like kintsugi, you know, that Japanese technique of repairing broken ceramics with gold. It doesn't hide the fractures. It honors them, illuminates them. It turns them into part of the beauty of the object, its history, its unique value." Nate extended his hand and intertwined his fingers with hers, that simple gesture of connection that had become natural between them in recent weeks. "I like that image," he said softly. "Us as broken vessels repaired with gold, more valuable for having been broken and rebuilt." They remained thus for a moment, in a comfortable silence, united by physical touch and shared understanding. Eliza contemplated their intertwined hands, hers smaller but equally marked by years of musical discipline, both with calluses and small scars, physical evidence of lives dedicated to art. "There's something I've been considering," she finally said, with a tone suggesting she had been ruminating on the idea for some time. "I think we should test our method on ourselves completely before offering it to others." Nate looked at her curiously. "Isn't that what we've been doing?" "To a certain extent," she conceded. "We've been gradually healing while developing the project. But we still haven't directly faced our greatest fears, the specific pieces that broke us." She saw the immediate understanding in his face, followed by a shadow of apprehension. "Beethoven's Ninth," he said, his voice barely audible, "and Rachmaninoff's Concerto," she completed. "We need to apply our methodology to those specific traumas, prove it really works where it matters most." The proposal floated between them, laden with potential for both liberation and renewed pain. It wasn't a light suggestion. It was an invitation to walk directly toward their deepest fears, armed only with the tools they had developed together. "We don't need to do it publicly," she quickly added, seeing the concern in his eyes. "Just for ourselves as a final test, as an act of faith in what we've created." Nate stood and walked to the window, contemplating the garden where roses and lavender competed for sunlight. His posture revealed the internal struggle, the debate between deeply rooted fear and the desire for liberation. "You're right," he finally said, turning to look at her. "We can't ask others to trust a method we haven't completely proven ourselves." He approached again and knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "But if we're going to do this, we'll do it together, step by step, without external pressure, without deadlines, without expectations of perfection. Just you and me facing our personal dragons with the tools we've forged." The intensity in his gaze, the mixture of determination and vulnerability, awakened in Eliza an emotion that went beyond professional companionship or even the emerging romantic connection. It was a deep recognition, soul to soul, of having found someone willing to walk with her into the fire, someone who understood exactly the cost and value of that journey. "Together," she confirmed, sealing the pact with a handshake that naturally transformed into an embrace, their bodies finding the comfort and strength they had learned to give each other. That afternoon, after reorganizing the studio for the new approach, they began with the first exercise of their program, creating an emotional map of the traumatic pieces. It wasn't about playing them yet, but listening attentively, identifying the specific moments that triggered anxiety responses, tracing the geography of fear to be able to navigate it later with greater awareness. They started with Nate, using a recording of the Ninth Symphony conducted by Leonard Bernstein. Sitting in silence, they observed how his body physically reacted to certain passages. The tension in his shoulders during the first movement accelerated breathing in specific sections of the scherzo, visible sweat on his palms as they approached the exact passage where he had experienced his block. Eliza documented each reaction, creating a visual record of critical points, while guiding Nate through conscious breathing techniques and sensory anchoring developed as part of their methodology. They weren't trying to eliminate the anxiety responses, but to observe them with compassion, to understand them as body signals that could be recognized and integrated rather than feared and avoided. "It's fascinating," commented Nate afterward, as they noted observations in their shared journal. "I can feel exactly where my body stores the memory of trauma. It's as if each measure had its own emotional imprint stamped in my muscles, in my breathing." Eliza nodded, understanding perfectly. "Music is inherently physical," she responded. "We experience it with our entire being, not just intellectually. That's why musical trauma is so profound, and also why healing must involve the complete body, not just the mind." The process would continue for days, weeks, gradually advancing from conscious listening toward active participation. First, intoning fragments in a safe environment, then playing isolated passages with deliberate modifications that interrupted traumatic patterns, and eventually addressing the complete pieces with a transformed approach. That night, as they dined together on the small terrace under a starry sky, there was a different feeling between them. Not just the intimacy that had naturally blossomed, but a kind of solemn camaraderie, like soldiers preparing for a significant battle, aware of both the risks and the importance of the mission. "You know," said Nate as he poured wine into simple glasses, "when the symphony cancelled their support, I thought it was the end, that we had come so far only to fail again." He took a sip, contemplating the stars that speckled the Lennox sky. But now I see that it could have been the best thing that happened to us. It forced us to redefine the project, to take it back to its essence, to what really matters, real, tangible, personal healing. Eliza considered his words, finding truth in them. If they had continued with institutional backing, they would have been subject to external expectations, deadlines, success criteria imposed from outside. This way, the project was truly theirs, shaped by their own experiences, responding to needs they intimately understood. Sometimes rejection is just a redirection, she reflected, a push toward the path we should be following, even if we couldn't see it clearly. She raised her glass in a small toast. To unexpected paths, she said, smiling, and to the courage to follow them together. Nate responded to the gesture, their glasses meeting with a crystalline clink that resonated in the quiet night. To the silence between notes, he added, and to learning to find music even there. The Lennox Public Library had never seen such activity in its small conference room. Additional chairs were brought from the storeroom, tightly accommodated to make room for nearly 40 people who had responded to the modest invitation. Free workshop, recovering musical joy after trauma. Eliza observed from a corner as participants entered timidly, recognizing in their postures and cautious gazes the same vulnerability she had carried for years. There were professional musicians from regional orchestras, conservatory professors, advanced students and dedicated amateurs. All united by a common experience, they had lost their pure connection with music due to traumatic experiences, creative blocks, stage anxiety, or debilitating perfectionism. Mrs. Caldwell, the librarian who had provided the historical archives, supervised the entrance with a satisfied smile, as if she had known from the beginning that those forgotten documents would blossom into something significant. "I see you've found your audience," she commented discreetly to Eliza as she passed with a tray of water glasses. "Or perhaps they've found you." Nate was adjusting the small synthesizer and laptop they would use for the demonstration. He wore a simple blue shirt and grey pants, deliberately informal to distance himself from the image of the tuxedoed conductor he had been for so many years. When he looked up and his eyes met Eliza's across the room, they shared a look of complicity and controlled nervousness. The previous 3 months had been intense. They had perfected their methodology, meticulously documented each exercise, tested each technique on themselves, with results that, while not miraculous, showed constant and significant progress. Nate could now listen to the complete ninth without experiencing panic attacks, and had even begun to practice conducting movements in private. Eliza, for her part, had traveled a similar path with the Rachmaninoff concerto, advancing from conscious listening to the modified interpretation of complete passages. But this afternoon represented a qualitative leap. It was the first time they would share their work publicly, that they would test whether what had helped them could benefit others. "I think we should begin," said Nate, approaching her when the room was full. "Are you ready?" Eliza took a deep breath, centering herself, as she had learned to do during her practice sessions. "Ready," she responded, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. They moved together to the front of the room. The murmur of conversations gradually died down as Nate cleared his throat. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his warm but firm voice filling the small room without effort. "Thank you for coming to this first workshop of the silence between notes." He paused, his eyes scanning the expectant faces. "My name is Nathaniel Thorne. Some of you might recognize me from my previous work as a conductor. Others might have heard rumors about my disappearance from the professional circuit." The direct honesty created a palpable current of attention in the room. "Those rumors are true. 3 years ago, I experienced a complete collapse during a rehearsal with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra in London. I froze, unable to continue, overcome by anxiety that had been silently growing for years." Eliza observed how participants unconsciously leaned forward, captivated by the unfiltered vulnerability that Nate offered. It wasn't the polished presentation they had rehearsed, but it was infinitely more powerful. "My colleague, Eliza Harlow," he continued, indicating her with a gesture, "experienced something similar during a concert at Carnegie Hall. 2 musicians, 2 trajectories, 2 collapses that eventually led us to meet here in Lennox and to develop together what we'll share with you today." Eliza stepped forward, taking the baton with a naturalness that reflected months of intimate collaboration. The goal is to develop a new, healthier, and more sustainable relationship with music, one that integrates the traumatic experience instead of denying or hiding it. During the following 2 hours, they guided the group through basic exercises of their program, conscious listening techniques, body mapping of emotional responses to music, breathing exercises specifically designed for musicians, and an introduction to their approach of therapeutic recomposition, deliberately modifying traumatic passages to interrupt the conditioned anxiety response. "What we've created isn't a miraculous method," she said, connecting with the hopeful gazes before her. "We don't promise you'll play exactly as before. In fact, that's not the goal." The response was immediate and moving. A middle-aged violinist shared how he had abandoned public performances after freezing during a crucial audition. A young pianist described her struggle with imposter syndrome that had ruined her conservatory experience. A clarinet teacher revealed how a verbally abusive conductor had destroyed his confidence to the point of developing physical symptoms whenever he tried to play. Different stories, but with common patterns: the relentless pressure, complete identity tied to technical perfection, the deep shame before human vulnerability in a field that demands superheroes, not people. When the workshop concluded, several participants approached with questions, requests for individual sessions, and, most significantly, expressions of gratitude for having named and validated experiences they had carried in solitude, believing they were the only weak ones in a world of seemingly invulnerable musicians. As they collected their materials, exhausted but exhilarated by the response, Mrs. Caldwell approached with an elegant woman in her 60s who had observed the workshop from the back of the room. "Eliza, Nathaniel, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Eleanor Whitfield," said the librarian. "She's the director of the new Berkshire Institute of Music." The woman extended her hand with a warm but evaluating smile. "It's been absolutely fascinating to observe your workshop," she said, with an accent suggesting years lived abroad. "I'm impressed not only by the methodology, but by the evident impact it's had on the participants." She exchanged a significant look with the librarian before continuing. "We're in the process of developing a wellness program for artists as part of the Institute's mission. I was wondering if you'd be interested in exploring a more formal collaboration." The proposal, unexpected and surprising, left them both momentarily speechless. After months working in isolation, after the painful rejection from Boston, the idea of regional institutional backing seemed almost unreal. "We'd be delighted to discuss it," Nate finally responded, regaining his composure. "Excellent." The woman extracted a business card from her purse. "Why don't you come to the Institute next week? We could talk more calmly about the possibilities." When Dr. Whitfield left, Eliza and Nate looked at each other, processing what had just happened. "Did she just offer us a job?" asked Eliza, incredulous. "I think she just offered us a platform," corrected Nate with a growing smile. "An opportunity to bring our work to more people, with official backing but regional, more aligned with our vision than Boston would have been." Mrs. Caldwell, who had remained discreetly close, intervened with an enigmatic smile. "Well-planted seeds eventually bloom, even if the growing season is longer than we expected." That night, as they celebrated with a simple dinner on Nate's terrace under a starry sky, the conversation naturally turned to the future that was beginning to take shape before them. "If we accept the Institute's proposal," reflected Eliza, playing with the stem of her wineglass, "it would mean staying in Massachusetts, establishing ourselves more permanently." Nate observed her attentively, sensitive to the layers of meaning in her comment. "Is that something you'd like?" he asked cautiously. "To stay?" The question floated between them, laden with implications that went far beyond the professional realm. In recent months, their relationship had deepened, evolving organically from creative collaboration toward an intimate connection that neither had actively sought, but that both deeply valued. Eliza contemplated the stars for a moment, considering how to respond. "When I returned to Lenox," she finally said, "I saw it as a temporary refuge, a place to hide while my wounds healed. I never imagined I would find a new purpose here, a direction that combined my past with something completely fresh." She looked at Nate directly, the candlelight drawing soft shadows on his face. "And I certainly never imagined I would find someone who understood so perfectly my struggles, my fears, my hopes. Nate extended his hand across the table, intertwining his fingers with hers in that gesture that had become their particular form of tactile communication. "When I returned to Lennox," he responded, "I was seeking silence, distance from the musical world that had rejected me. What I found instead was a new form of music, one more honest, more human." He gently squeezed her hand. "And you. I found someone who inspired me to create again, who showed me there was value in vulnerability." The moment was laden with emotion, with mutual recognition of what they had built together, both personally and professionally. "I think we could do something really significant with the Institute," said Eliza, allowing the conversation to return to the safer terrain of the project, reach more musicians, properly document our methods, perhaps even publish them eventually. "And we could continue developing ourselves as artists," added Nate, "not just as music therapists, but as musicians who are rediscovering their own voice." In that simple addition, ourselves as artists, Eliza felt a wave of gratitude for how her identity had evolved. She was no longer the pianist who failed, as she had defined herself for 3 years. She was an evolving artist, someone who used her complete experience, including trauma, to create something new and valuable. "I have something to show you," she said suddenly, standing. "Wait here." She disappeared into the house, returning moments later with a folder Nate hadn't seen before. She opened it carefully, revealing handwritten scores. "I've been working on this during the past few weeks," she explained, with a touch of nervousness in her voice. "It's a piece for piano and electronics, based on our methodology but taken to a concert format." Nate examined the pages with growing interest, his expression transforming into amazement as he understood what he was seeing. "Eliza, this is extraordinary. You've taken fragments of the Rachmaninoff and completely transformed them, incorporating elements of the sonic textures we developed for the therapeutic sessions. It's called reconstruction," she said, closely observing his reaction. "It's my way of reclaiming that music, of transforming trauma into something new." Nate looked at her with pure admiration. "Do you plan to perform it?" The question was significant. Performing an original piece would mean a return to the stage, a step that just a few months ago would have seemed impossible. "I'm considering it," she answered honestly. "Not at Carnegie Hall, not yet, but perhaps in a more intimate, safer environment. As part of our work at the Institute, maybe." The determination in her voice, the spark of anticipation in her eyes, was for Nate the most powerful evidence of how much she had healed in these months. It wasn't a complete cure. Both knew that this type of trauma never completely disappears, but it was a profound transformation, an integration of the wound into a more complex and resilient identity. "I'll be in the front row when you do," he said with genuine emotion. "And I'll be there to support you every step of the way, whatever your decision." Under the starry Lennox sky, with fragments of an original composition between them and new possibilities unfolding on the horizon, both felt a quiet certainty. They had found their way forward, not by avoiding the pain of their past experiences, but by transforming it into something that could also illuminate the path for others. The silence between notes was no longer an abyss of fear, but a space of possibility, of breathing, of shared humanity. And in that space, they had found not only renewed music, but also a love that would not have been possible without the fractures that had brought them here, to this moment, to each other. The auditorium of the new Berkshire Institute of Music shone under soft, ambient lighting. 200 dark blue velvet seats, nearly all occupied, formed concentric semicircles around an intimate circular stage, specifically designed to create a closer experience between artists and audience. In the center, a gleaming black Steinway grand piano waited expectantly under the spotlights, flanked by discreet electronic equipment that seemed out of place in a traditionally classical venue. Backstage, Eliza breathed deeply, employing the breathing techniques she had perfected over months. Her dress, a simple design in midnight blue with silver details that captured light like droplets of water, had been carefully chosen for this night, her official return to the stage after 4 years of absence. 5 minutes, announced a young assistant, briefly appearing in the waiting room. Nate, standing beside her in a dark grey suit, took her hands in his. They didn't need words after all they had shared, but he offered them anyway. "Remember, you're not here to be perfect," he said softly. "You're here to be authentic, to share something real. Eliza nodded, grateful for the reminder. The past 6 months, since that first workshop at the public library, had been a whirlwind of activity. The Institute had embraced their program with enthusiasm, offering them not only institutional backing, but also creative freedom. They had developed a series of workshops that had attracted musicians from across the country, documented their methods in a manual being considered for publication, and even begun to receive invitations to present their work at national conservatories. But tonight was different. It wasn't a therapeutic workshop or an academic presentation. It was a concert, the first in the New Voices cycle organized by the Institute, where innovative artists could share works that challenged traditional categories, and Eliza had been selected to inaugurate it with Reconstruction, the piece that had grown from preliminary sketches to a complete 30-minute work that interwove acoustic piano with electronic elements and transformed fragments of the Rachmaninoff concerto that had once destroyed her. "It's time," announced the assistant, reappearing. Nate gave her a last squeeze of the hands and a gentle kiss on the cheek. "I'll be in the front row," he whispered. "But more importantly, you'll be completely present on stage. You won't mentally flee as you used to, nor lose yourself in fear." He was right, as always, when it came to identifying her patterns. For years, even before the collapse, Eliza had developed the habit of absenting herself during performances. Her body played perfectly, but her mind was elsewhere, monitoring, judging, anticipating error, never truly inhabiting the music. It was a form of self-protection that, paradoxically, had made her more vulnerable to collapse when it finally occurred. Now, as she walked toward the stage, she felt something radically different. Presence. She was completely in her body, aware of each step, of the texture of the dress against her skin, of the familiar weight of responsibility, but also of the new lightness of authentic purpose. The audience applauded courteously as she took her place before the piano. Among the semi-illuminated faces, she distinguished Dr. Whitfield in the front row beside Nate. Also Mrs. Caldwell from the library, some participants from their workshops, specialized journalists who had begun to take interest in their innovative approach to musical recovery. She didn't see her family. The invitation sent to Connecticut had remained unanswered, a wound she was still learning to integrate into her new identity. Instead of sitting immediately, Eliza approached the microphone installed beside the piano. It wasn't customary for classical performers to speak directly to the audience, but this wasn't a conventional night. "Good evening." Her voice sounded clear in the sound system, more confident than she felt. "Thank you for joining us on this special night." She paused, seeking the exact words. "The piece I'll perform, Reconstruction, was born from a process of personal healing. 4 years ago, I experienced a collapse during a concert that ended my career as I knew it. For a long time, I believed that moment of failure completely defined me. The raw honesty created absolute silence in the auditorium, an attention that could be physically felt. What I discovered, with the help of extraordinary collaborators," her eyes briefly found Nate's, "is that our wounds aren't the end of the story, but sometimes the beginning of a more authentic one. Reconstruction takes the fragments of the music that once broke me and transforms them into something new, not erasing the fracture, but honoring it as part of the journey." With a small nod of thanks for the audience's attention, Eliza finally sat before the piano. She placed her hands on the keys and, instead of immediately launching into playing, closed her eyes and breathed consciously, establishing connection with the present moment, with the instrument, with her own body. When she finally began to play, she did so with a solitary, sustained note that reverberated in the perfectly tuned acoustic space, a note that contained all the intention, all the history, all the future of the piece. From there, the music developed organically, first with minimal, fragmented phrases that evoked disintegration, trauma, loss. Gradually, subtle electronic elements were incorporated, creating textures that could never be achieved with the piano alone. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, fragments of the Rachmaninoff concerto began to emerge. Not direct quotations, but transformations, like memories distorted by time and perspective. These fragments, once laden with terror and traumatic associations, now appeared in new contexts, surrounded by different harmonies, freed from the burden of technical perfection and reconverted into personal expressive elements. The piece built bridges between the classical and contemporary, between the acoustic and electronic, between the traumatic past and an integrated present. It wasn't music that sought to impress with virtuosity, though the technical passages were there, but to move with authenticity, inviting listeners on a journey of fragmentation and reunification. As her fingers danced across the keys, Eliza experienced something she thought forever lost: pure joy in musical creation. Not the distant satisfaction of duty fulfilled or technique perfectly executed, but genuine pleasure in the very act of creating sound, of communicating through a language deeper than words. In the most intense moments of the performance, she felt as if she were completely exposed and completely protected at the same time, vulnerable and powerful in her vulnerability. The notes flowed not just from her fingers, but from her entire being, from each lived experience, including, especially, the moments of failure that had led her here. When the piece reached its final climax, a transformative reinterpretation of the exact passage where she had collapsed 4 years ago, Eliza felt silent tears slide down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness or even catharsis, but of deep recognition. She had completed a circle, had transformed her personal narrative without denying it. The final notes gradually faded, blending with electronic elements that created a sense of continuity, of open space, of future possibilities. The silence that followed was absolute, that precious moment where music still resonates in immediate memory before ordinary reality returns. And then, the applause began. It wasn't the tumultuous ovation of major commercial concerts, but something equally powerful, a genuine, respectful, deeply felt recognition. When Eliza finally looked up, she saw something she hadn't expected. Several people in the audience were also silently crying. She had created something that resonated beyond her personal experience, touching universal places of human fragility and resilience. As she bowed in gratitude, her gaze met Nate's in the front row. His eyes shone with pride, with love, with complete understanding of what she had just achieved. Not just a successful performance, but an act of personal integration, of reclaiming her artistic voice in completely new terms. As the applause continued, Eliza gestured toward the side of the stage, inviting Nate to join her. After a moment of surprise, he rose and took his place beside her. This hadn't been part of the program, but she felt it was essential to publicly acknowledge the collaboration that had made this night possible. Hand in hand, they bowed together before the still applauding audience. In that moment, Eliza had a deep certainty. This wasn't an ending, not even a new beginning. It was simply a point of continuity on a path that would continue to evolve, with its own challenges and joys, but that they would now travel together, carrying the message of the silence between notes to all those who needed to hear it. Music, which had once been a source of trauma, had transformed into a vehicle of healing. And in that process, she too had transformed, not despite her fractures, but through them, like those Japanese ceramics repaired with gold, more beautiful and valuable precisely for having been broken. 2 years later, the garden of the restored house on the outskirts of Lenox shone under the spring sun. The roses, now fully established, offered their first buds of the year, promising an explosion of color in the coming weeks. A small stone fountain, a new addition to the landscape, sang its constant aquatic melody, creating a natural counterpoint to the sounds emerging from the adjacent structure. The old barn, converted into a music studio, vibrated with activity. Through its open windows, welcoming the spring breeze, a group of 6 musicians could be seen working together, some with traditional instruments, others with electronic equipment, all focused on the creative process with a serene intensity. In the center of the group, Nate guided the session with gentle gestures, so different from the broad, dramatic movements he had employed as a traditional orchestra conductor. This wasn't conventional conducting, but facilitation, creating a safe space where each musician could explore their own voice within the collective structure. From the terrace of the main house, Eliza observed the scene with a cup of tea between her hands, her face reflecting the tranquil satisfaction of someone seeing a dream gradually materialize. The Silence Between Notes Center for Musical Creation and Recovery had begun as an ambitious idea and was now a tangible reality, a space dedicated to musicians in the process of recovery and reinvention, where therapy and artistic creation intertwined without artificial hierarchies. The transformation of the property had been a gradual process, partially funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts after the publication of their manual, Music and Trauma, an Integrative Approach, which had generated international interest in specialized circles. It wasn't a large center, nor did it aspire to be. Its strength resided precisely in its intimacy, in the personalized attention, in the authentic community created between participants and facilitators. The sound of a car approaching on the gravel path interrupted her thoughts. She recognized the Institute's official vehicle and smiled, remembering the scheduled appointment. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the passenger seat, followed by a man Eliza didn't immediately recognize, tall, distinguished, with an elegant portfolio under his arm. "Eliza, dear," greeted the doctor as she approached. "I hope we're not interrupting the session." "Not at all," she responded, descending the steps to receive them. "They're in full creative process. Nate won't want to be interrupted for at least another hour." The doctor nodded understandingly before making introductions. "This is Mr. Lawrence Davies, director of Juilliard School in New York. He's interested in learning more about our joint program." The man extended his hand with a warm smile. "The pleasure is mine, Ms. Harlow. Your work is generating important conversations in international educational circles. We're considering implementing elements of your methodology in our curriculum to address the silent epidemic of burnout and anxiety among our students." Eliza guided them to the terrace where she had prepared refreshments anticipating the visit. As the conversation flowed about possibilities for international collaboration, her eyes occasionally drifted to the studio, where Nate continued guiding the session with a mixture of gentle authority and deep respect for each musician's process. "What impresses me most about your approach," commented Mr. Davies while accepting a glass of lemonade, "is how you've managed to integrate personal healing with artistic excellence. Traditionally, conservatories have completely separated these aspects, as if technique could exist independently of the performer's emotional well-being." "That false separation is precisely what we try to address," responded Eliza, settling into her chair. "Music doesn't exist outside the musician. Each note carries the imprint of our humanity, including our wounds and our healing processes." Dr. Whitfield smiled with evident pride. She had bet on this project when it was barely a tentative idea, and now it had become a model that attracted international attention. "The program at the Institute has surpassed all our expectations," she added. "The reintegrated music concerts have become one of our most popular cycles, and the workshops have waiting lists. I believe we've touched a need that was there, waiting to be recognized." The sound of the studio door opening interrupted the conversation. The musicians emerged, talking animatedly, with that particular glow in their eyes that Eliza had learned to recognize, the satisfaction of someone who has genuinely connected with their creative voice. Nate bid them farewell individually, exchanging a few personalized words with each, before noticing the presence of visitors on the terrace. He approached with light steps, the energy of the session still vibrating in his body. At 42, he looked younger than when Eliza had first met him in that Lenox cafe, as if the work they had developed together had rejuvenated something essential in him. After formal introductions and an animated conversation about contemporary music pedagogy, Mr. Davies finally presented the official proposal he had come to make. "We'd like to invite both of you to New York next semester for a 3-month residency. You would lead workshops for our students and faculty, and we'd culminate with a concert where you, Ms. Harlow, would perform Reconstruction and some of your new compositions." The proposal hung in the air, laden with implications. New York, Juilliard, one of the most prestigious and traditional institutions in the classical music world, opening its doors to an approach that had been born precisely as a response to the destructive pressures of that very world. Eliza and Nate exchanged a glance, one of those silent communications they had perfected in their years together. "It's a very generous proposal," Nate finally responded, "and a meaningful one. It demonstrates a real commitment to change in musical culture." "We'd love to accept," added Eliza, "with one condition." Mr. Davies raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "We'd like some of our current participants to accompany us as assistants and co-facilitators. This work isn't about us as isolated experts, but about creating community, about transforming individual experiences into collective wisdom. The request provoked an appreciative smile from the Juilliard director. "Precisely that kind of thinking is what we hoped for from you." Considerate agreed. As the visitors departed, promising to send the formal details in the coming days, Eliza and Nate remained on the terrace, contemplating the garden where bees lazily buzzed among lavender and thyme. The silence between them was comfortable, full of shared thoughts. "New York," Nate finally said, as if tasting the word. "Who would have imagined 3 years ago?" Eliza took his hand, intertwining their fingers in that gesture that had become their particular form of physical connection. "Life has a curious way of taking us exactly where we need to be," she responded. "Even when the path passes through places we would have preferred to avoid." Nate nodded, perfectly understanding the reference to their respective collapses, those moments of total rupture that paradoxically had opened the way to a more authentic and fulfilling life. "Do you think we're ready?" he asked, with a shade of vulnerability in his voice that he only showed with her. "Not for the workshops or the concert, but to return to that world, to the epicenter of traditional classical music." It was a legitimate question. They had built something precious here, in this quiet corner of Massachusetts, away from the pressures and expectations of the major musical institutions. New York represented a re-entry into that universe, albeit on different terms. "I think we're ready precisely because we no longer need their validation," Eliza responded after consideration. "We're going as people who have something valuable to offer, not as those desperately seeking acceptance." She rose and approached the edge of the terrace, contemplating the studio where so many transformations had occurred. In the distance, the Berkshire Mountains were silhouetted against an intense blue sky, reminding her of the permanence of certain things against the transience of others. "Besides," she added with a soft smile, "we can always return here. This is no longer just a temporary refuge, it's our home, our center." Nate joined her, surrounding her waist with an arm in a gesture of natural intimacy. "Do you know what day it is?" he asked, returning to a question he had posed years before. Eliza looked at him curiously. "Tuesday. It's June 3rd, he responded with a significant smile. "Exactly 3 years since you first appeared at my door." The coincidence surprised her. 3 years, 1,095 days of gradual transformation, of patient building, of challenges overcome together, of love growing in unexpected terrain. "It feels like a lifetime," she murmured, echoing her words from that distant conversation. "And we're just beginning," he responded, leaning to kiss her softly. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the garden in golden hues and turning the music studio into an almost mythical structure, Eliza reflected on the extraordinary journey she had undertaken. From being the humiliated and abandoned pianist on a stage to becoming a creator of new musical paths. From victim of toxic perfectionism to facilitator of collective healing processes. From a woman broken by failure to a complete artist who incorporated each scar into her expression. It hadn't been an easy or linear path. There had been setbacks, dark days, moments of doubt, but each challenge had been a note in a broader composition, each obstacle an opportunity to deepen into authenticity. That night, after a quiet dinner accompanied by the sound of crickets and the aroma of jasmine, Eliza sat before the piano in the living room. Not to practice or compose, but simply to be with the music, to allow it to flow through her hands without expectations or judgments. Her fingers naturally found a melody that had been forming in her mind for days, soft, contemplative, with distant echoes of all she had lived and promises of what was to come. A melody that spoke of completed circles and ascending spirals, of endings that are beginnings and beginnings that honor what has ended. Nate approached silently, sitting beside her on the bench. He didn't interrupt her performance, simply offered his presence, his complete attention, his deep understanding of what music meant to her now, not a prison of unattainable perfection, but a garden where authentic human connection could be cultivated. As the last notes faded into the night air, Eliza felt a serene certainty settle within her. It didn't matter what New York would bring, nor the challenges that would surely appear along the way. She had found her center, her voice, her purpose. And most importantly, she had found someone with whom to share both sound and silence, both notes and the spaces between them. In that moment of perfect quietude, with her hands resting on the keys and Nate's warm presence beside her, Eliza Harlow finally understood the truth she had been seeking since that fateful day at Carnegie Hall. The most powerful music isn't born of impeccable technique or iron discipline, but of the capacity to remain vulnerable and authentic even when everything seems lost, to transform wounds into wisdom, failure into growth, an ending into a new and richer beginning. And that understanding, that embodied knowledge, was the most valuable gift she could bring to the world. Note by note, heart to heart, silence to silence,